The register had been signed at 9:30. That was established beyond question, the ink still faintly wet when the chambermaid collected the key at 10. What was not established, and what no one troubled to ask until rather too late, was why a man who had booked 3 nights and paid in full had packed his valise before dinner. Guests who intend to stay do not pack. Guests who intend to leave do not pay for 3 nights in advance. Mr. Gerald Ashworth had done both. By morning, he was dead in the courtyard beneath the weeping ash, and his valise was nowhere to be found. Welcome to Marple Mysteries, where the English countryside conceals far more than it reveals. Tonight's story takes us to a rain-soaked market town inn, where the most dangerous thing at the bar is not the bitter. It is the man smiling into it. This is Death at the Weeping Ash Inn. Chapter 1. The Inn at Dryford Halt. The village of Dryford Halt possessed, as Miss Jane Marple later remarked to her niece in a letter never quite finished, the particular quality of a place that had long ago decided nothing interesting would ever happen to it, and had arranged itself accordingly. The high street was brief and sensible. There was a post office that doubled as a tobacconist, a butcher whose window display suggested a professional competence entirely at odds with his conversation, a lending library staffed by a woman named Mrs. Ogden, who had read nothing since 1931 and saw no compelling reason to begin again. And at the far end of the street, set slightly back behind a low stone wall, and an ancient ash tree whose weeping branches swept the cobbles like a slow, melancholy broom, of the Weeping Ash Inn. The inn had stood for 300 years, and looked from certain angles as though it intended to stand for 300 more, purely out of stubbornness. Its timbers were dark, its ceilings low, its fireplaces efficient in the manner of things built before comfort was considered optional. The current proprietor, a lean and watchful man named Howard Pelch, had inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his, and Pelch managed the establishment with the grim pride of a man who would have greatly preferred to be doing something else entirely, but had never, at any critical juncture, identified precisely what. It was into this setting that Miss Marple arrived on the 14th of October, on a Tuesday, by the 3:20 from Paddington, which was in fact the 4:11, and which deposited her on the platform at Dryford Halt with her small leather case, her knitting bag, and an expression of mild, interested contentment that those who knew her well had learned to regard with cautious respect. She was visiting her old friend Dorothy Crayle, who kept a cottage on the lane behind the church, and had been unwell since August, with something the local doctor described as her nerves, and Dorothy described as his incompetence. Miss Marple had written to say she would come for a fortnight. Dorothy had replied that the cottage spare room was ready, and there was a decent butcher 3 doors down, which, in Dorothy's correspondence, constituted both welcome and information in one efficient stroke. Miss Marple had taken a room at the Weeping Ash for her first night only, having arrived a day earlier than expected, I not wishing to inconvenience Dorothy with the extra meal. She had noticed the ash tree immediately. It was the sort of tree one noticed, vast and grey and oddly sorrowful, its long pale branches trailing to within inches of the stone courtyard beneath. Beautiful in the way of things that carry their age visibly, without apology. She had paused on the path to study it for a moment, her head tilted slightly, before following the porter through the inn's low door. The bar that evening held 4 guests and 2 locals. Miss Marple settled herself in the corner chair nearest the fireplace. Not the warmest chair, which was occupied by a large man in tweeds reading a farming journal, but the chair with the broadest view of the room, and ordered a pot of tea and a slice of whatever cake the kitchen had available, which turned out to be a respectable Victoria sponge. She was, to all appearances, a small, white-haired elderly lady, knitting something in pale blue wool, and paying no particular attention to anyone. She was, in fact, paying attention to everyone. The large man in tweeds was Colonel Basil Fenton, recently retired, with the particular restlessness of a man unaccustomed to evenings not structured by obligation. He had ordered whisky and was on his second. He had also, Miss Marple noted, positioned himself with his back to the door, a preference or a habit. She was not yet certain which. Across the room, at a small table near the window, a young woman sat alone over a glass of sherry she had not touched. She was perhaps 28, handsome in a composed, deliberate way, and dressed for travel in a dark coat that was better quality than it first appeared. Her name, as Miss Marple would learn from the porter when he brought fresh hot water, was Miss Cecily Vane. She was also booked for 3 nights. She and the young woman had arrived, the porter mentioned with the slightly proprietary air of inn staff, who regard the guest register as a social document within 20 minutes of one another. The other guest, the one who had arrived 20 minutes before Miss Vane, was at the bar itself. His name, as Miss Marple had already read upside down in the register when Pelch turned it for her to sign, was Gerald Ashworth. He was perhaps 45, a compact, well-presented man with good shoes and a slightly too easy manner. The manner of someone accustomed to making strangers comfortable, yet not entirely for innocent reasons. He was speaking to Howard Pelch about nothing, the road, the weather, whether the trout in the local stream were worth the effort, with the focused sociability of a man who wished to be remembered as pleasant, and to remember as much as possible about his surroundings. Miss Marple knitted 3 rows. Ashworth laughed at something Pelch said. It was a good laugh, genuine enough, she thought. But his eyes, in the moment after, moved to the door of the inn with the quick, habitual check of someone who has spent a good deal of time waiting to see who comes through it. Miss Vane had not looked up from her untouched sherry. The fire shifted in the grate. The ash tree moved in the October wind beyond the dark window, its long branches tapping once, quite softly, against the glass. And Miss Marple turned her knitting and began the next row. Chapter 2. What the Ash Tree Witnessed. The body was found at 6:17 in the morning by a kitchen boy named Pip Rudder, who had come out to the courtyard to empty the ash bucket, and instead stood for a long, blank moment, staring at Gerald Ashworth's face, before dropping the bucket entirely, and running back through the scullery door with a sound that was not quite a shout, and not quite anything else. Howard Pelch reached the courtyard in his dressing gown and slippers. He stood over the body for precisely 4 seconds, then went back inside to telephone the police. He did not cover the body. He did not touch anything. He had the instinct, peculiar to certain practical men, of knowing when a situation had passed entirely beyond his management. The Gerald Ashworth lay on his back beneath the weeping ash, one arm extended, the other folded across his chest with an odd, almost arranged quality, as though someone had begun to compose him and thought better of it. His evening clothes were undisturbed. His shoes were clean. There was no visible wound, no blood, no sign of a struggle in the damp cobblestones around him. His expression was faintly surprised, in the mild, retrospective way of a man who has received unexpected news rather than a mortal blow. The ash tree moved above him in the early morning grey, its branches trailing. Constable Reeve arrived from the next village at 7, followed at past by Inspector Dace from the county station, a brisk, edge-slope-shouldered man of 50, who wore his authority the way certain men wear an ill-fitting coat, convinced it suited him perfectly. By 8 o'clock, the body had been removed, the courtyard roped with twine, and the guests of the Weeping Ash Inn had been asked with varying degrees of firmness to remain available. By 8:15, Dryford Halt knew everything, which is to say it knew nothing accurately and a great deal enthusiastically. Miss Marple came down to breakfast at her usual time of 8:30, ordered porridge and toast, and found the dining-room already alive with the particular quality of excitement that small communities produce in the aftermath of the unthinkable. A brightness in the eyes, a leaning forward at tables, voices pitched just below the level of indecency. Ogden from the lending library had arrived, though she was not a guest, to speak with Pelch about the shock of it all, and had remained quite naturally for coffee. The butcher's wife, a stout and enormously satisfied woman named Beryl Trask, had come on the same errand and reached the same conclusion about coffee. Colonel Fenton sat at the large table by the window, his farming journal abandoned, his expression combining outrage with a poorly concealed vitality. He had served in 2 theatres of war, Miss Marple reflected, and here at last was something to match his interior weather. "Poison," he announced, to no one in particular and everyone in general. "Mark my words, no wound on him, no struggle, the man simply fell. Poison is a coward's weapon." "The police haven't said poison," said Mrs. Trask, as with the air of someone correcting a point while agreeing with its substance entirely. "The police haven't said anything," Fenton replied, "which means they suspect everything." Miss Ogden stirred her coffee. "I always thought there was something about that man, something watchful." "You'd never met him," said Mrs. Trask. "One needn't meet a person," Mrs. Ogden replied with quiet conviction, "to know." Miss Marple spread a thin layer of marmalade on her toast and said nothing. She had found over many years that the first hours after a violent death produced conversation of remarkable frankness, and that the wisest course was simply to provide the silence into which that frankness could arrange itself. Pelch appeared briefly from the kitchen passage, looking as though he had aged 3 years since the previous evening, and he spoke quietly with Constable Reeve near the door, then disappeared again. Reeve made a note in his book that appeared, from Miss Marple's angle, to contain no more than 4 words. Miss Cecily Vane came down at 9. She was dressed with the same composed precision as the night before. A grey wool dress, hair neat, face arranged into the careful blankness of someone who has decided in advance how they intend to appear. She accepted tea, declined food, and sat at her table by the window without looking toward the courtyard, which was, Miss Marple considered, either entirely natural or rather pointed, depending entirely on what the young woman knew. Fenton watched her with the directness of a man who has never learned that watching people is something one is expected to conceal. "You knew him," he said. Not unkindly, but without softness. Miss Vane looked up. "I beg your pardon, Ashworth. You knew him. I saw you look at each other last night when he came through the bar." "I noticed him," she said, "as one notices anyone in a small room." "That's not what I mean. Colonel," said Mrs. Trask with warning in her syllables. Fentham subsided, but did not retract. Miss Vane returned to her tea. Her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were quite steady. Steadier, in fact, than they had any natural reason to be. It was the steadiness, not any trembling, that was interesting. Inspector Dace reappeared at 9:30, spoke briefly with Constable Reeve, and then stood in the centre of the dining room in the manner of a man about to deliver news he has already decided the shape of. "Mr. Ashworth," he said, "he died sometime between 10 in the evening and 1 in the morning. The precise cause is being determined. We will be speaking with each of you individually." He paused. "We ask for your cooperation and your patience." "And the valise?" said Miss Marple pleasantly from her corner. Dace turned. He had not, until this moment, registered her presence. This was not unusual. "I beg your pardon, madam." "Mr. Ashworth's valise," she said with a small, apologetic smile. "It was packed before dinner," the chambermaid remarked on it. "I wondered whether you'd found it." There was a brief, very particular silence. "We are pursuing all relevant inquiries," said Inspector Dace. Which meant, Miss Marple thought, settling her knitting into her lap, that they had not. Chapter 3. 3 innocent questions. Miss Marple had always found that the best way to learn a thing was to appear entirely uninterested in learning it. She set out at 10:30 with her knitting bag over one arm and her small leather purse over the other, wearing her good grey coat and the expression of a woman whose only ambition for the morning was a brief constitutional and perhaps a look at the post office window. She told no one she was going. She mentioned to the girl behind the desk that she might be back for 11's if the kitchen was doing anything warm, and she stepped out through the inn's low front door into the pale October air, as though the whole matter of Gerald Ashworth's death was a thing she had already set comfortably behind her. She had not. The weeping ash stood motionless this morning, of the wind having dropped entirely. Its branches hung in long pale curtains, still and somehow attentive. Miss Marple paused on the path and studied it for a moment, the great spread of it, the way it commanded the courtyard without appearing to. Then she walked on toward the High Street. Her first stop was the post office. The woman behind the post office counter was named Mrs. Partridge, a small, dry, economical person who had worked the counter for 22 years, and considered herself, with some justification, to be the most reliably informed person in Dryford Halt. She knew who received letters from solicitors and who from hospitals. She knew whose magazine subscriptions had quietly lapsed, and whose had recently and significantly upgraded. She knew a great deal, and she had the particular quality of knowing it without appearing to, which Miss Marple recognized as a form of professional discretion she genuinely respected. Miss Marple purchased a book of stamps she did not urgently need, and remarked, while pressing her purse closed, that it had been quite a dreadful morning. Mrs. Partridge agreed that it had. "I imagine," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "that Mr. Ashworth must have been a stranger to the village. I don't believe I've seen him here before." "He was not a stranger," said Mrs. Partridge, with the quiet precision of someone correcting a minor but significant error. "He came through in July, stayed 2 nights, asked a number of questions about properties in the area, who owned what had changed hands recently." "How interesting," said Miss Marple. "A developer, perhaps?" "He did not say." Mrs. Partridge paused. He was asking specifically about the Crayle land, the parcels behind the church." Miss Marple's expression did not alter in any perceptible way. Dorothy Crayle's land? Her late husband's. She holds it still, I believe, though there have been discussions. Mrs. Partridge offered this last word with the careful neutrality of a woman who knows precisely what she means and intends the listener to understand it without her having to be specific. Miss Marple thanked her warmly for the stamps and left. Her second stop was the butcher. Mr. Trask was a large, straightforward man who said what he thought and thought what he said, which made him, in Miss Marple's estimation, simultaneously easier and more difficult to extract information from than his wife. Easy because he would answer questions directly, but difficult because he answered only what was asked and supplied nothing from the surrounding territory. She asked, while examining a display of lamb chops with apparent seriousness, whether the inn did a decent trade in the off-season. Trask allowed that it did tolerably well. The bar had regulars. Pelch was a fair landlord, if a silent one. "And before Mr. Pelch?" she asked pleasantly. Trask looked up. Before Pelch, it was his father's. Old Raymond Pelch. Different sort of man entirely, very sociable, always in the bar himself. Howard took after the mother's side, keeps his own counsel. The inn has been in the family a long time. 3 generations at least, though there was a period, 15 years back, when there was some question about the title. He wrapped her chops in paper with practised efficiency. Was some business with a loan that went difficult. Raymond Pelch nearly lost it, from what people say. Someone bought the debt and sat on it. Let him sweat a good while before calling it. "How unpleasant," said Miss Marple. "It was." He took her money and returned her change. Never did establish who it was that bought it. Went through a solicitor in London. Miss Marple placed the chops in her bag, thanked him, and continued up the street. Her third stop was not a shop at all. She sat down on the bench outside the lending library, arranged her knitting, and waited with the patient unremarkableness of a woman resting her feet. Within 8 minutes, Pip Rudder, the kitchen boy, came along the pavement on some errand, head down, hands in his pockets, still wearing the slightly dazed expression of someone whose morning has permanently rearranged his expectations of the world. Miss Marple said quite gently, "You must have had a terrible shock, my dear." He stopped. He was perhaps 16, with a thin, honest face, and the wide eyes of someone who has not yet learned to manage his own transparency. "Yes, ma'am." "Did you know him at all, Mr. Ashworth?" "Not to speak to." He hesitated. "I seen him, though, last night, late on." Miss Marple's needles continued their quiet, steady movement. "Oh?" "Gone 11. I was taking the kitchen scraps round. He was standing under the ash tree, just standing." Pip frowned. Thought it was odd, but he wasn't doing anything wrong. Was he alone? The boy's hesitation lasted only a second, but it was a second Miss Marple did not miss. "Yes," he said. "Oh, far as I could tell." She smiled warmly, thanked him for his time, and told him he'd been very helpful. He walked away looking faintly uncertain about what, precisely, he had said. Miss Marple counted her stitches. He had not been alone. That much was now clear. The question that interested her, the question that had interested her since the moment Dace confirmed the valise was missing, was not who had been with Gerald Ashworth under the ash tree at 11 o'clock at night. It was who had come back for the bag. Chapter 4. The inspector's arithmetic Inspector Dace conducted his interviews in the small private dining room off the main bar, which Pelch had cleared of its usual furniture, and furnished with a table, 3 chairs, and a jug of water that no one touched. He worked through the guests and staff with the methodical efficiency of a man who has already formed a conclusion. and is engaged in the process of collecting evidence to support it, which is a different thing entirely from investigation, though it superficially resembles one. Miss Marple was interviewed at 11 o'clock. She gave her name, her address, her reason for being in Dryford Halt, and confirmed that she had been in her room by 10:30 the previous evening, and had heard nothing of note during the night. She mentioned Dorothy Crayle. She mentioned the Victoria Sponge. She said nothing about Pip Rudder, the valise, or Mrs. Partridge's remarks concerning the Crayle land, because no one asked. And Miss Marple had learned very early in life that the information one volunteers is rarely as useful as the information one retains. Dace thanked her politely, and made a note that occupied approximately 4 words. She returned to her corner chair and her knitting, and listened to the inn settle around her. By early afternoon, the shape of Dace's conclusion had made its way through the building with the particular speed that conclusions travel in enclosed spaces. Constable Reeve, speaking to Pelch near the kitchen door in a voice calibrated for privacy and achieving the opposite, conveyed that the inspector was focusing his attention on Miss Cecily Vane. The reasoning, as Miss Marple assembled it from 3 separate fragments of overheard conversation, was as follows. Miss Vane had known Ashworth. This was now established. She had admitted it to Dace in private, when the Colonel's public accusation proved, upon reflection, impossible to sustain with a straight face, and they had met in London the previous spring, through professional channels she described as financial consulting, which Dace appeared to regard as either admirably concise or suspiciously vague, depending on his mood. Ashworth had, it emerged, borrowed a sum of money from Miss Vane, a considerable sum. The details were not public, but the existence of the debt was confirmed by a letter found in Ashworth's jacket pocket. Not the missing valise, which remained absent, but the breast pocket of his evening coat, written in a hand that Dace's sergeant identified as feminine, without any further investigation into what that identification might or might not establish. The letter was 2 lines. Miss Marple did not see it, but Reeve's voice carried adequately. You know what is owed. Dryford Halt, the 14th, come alone, Miss Vane, which when pressed, confirmed she had written it. She also confirmed, with the same unshakable composure that had interested Miss Marple at breakfast, that she had not left her room after 9:30. She had no witness to this. She required none, she said, because it was the truth. Dace found this response unsatisfying, which was professionally reasonable, and suspicious, which was professionally premature. Colonel Fentham held court at the large window table through luncheon, which he ate with appetite and conviction in equal measure. Cherchez la femme, he announced to the general table, deploying his French with the confidence of a man who had learned it in circumstances that did not encourage nuance. Always, every time. In 30 years in the service, I never once saw a man die mysteriously without a woman at the bottom of it. You were in the logistics division, said Mrs. Trask, who had returned for lunch on grounds that remained unclear, but were warmly accepted by Pelch, who valued her custom. Fentham ignored this. She lured him here. The letter proves it. The letter proved she wanted to meet him, said Miss Marple mildly, without looking up from her knitting. Which is not the same thing. Fentham looked at her. It was the look of a man reassessing a piece of furniture that has unexpectedly spoken. You think she's innocent? I think, said Miss Marple pleasantly, that a woman who intends to commit murder does not generally write her intentions in her own hand and leave them in the dead man's pocket. That would be untidy. In my experience, people who do untidy things are either very clever or very foolish. Miss Vane does not strike me as foolish." There was a brief silence at the table. "What does she strike you as?" asked Mrs. Trask with genuine curiosity. "Frightened," said Miss Marple, "which is a different thing altogether from guilty, though people are forever confusing the two." She turned her knitting and said nothing further. The medical report reached Dace at 2 o'clock. Ashworth had died of cardiac arrest, induced by a concentrated quantity of digitalin, a compound derived from the foxglove plant, colourless, tasteless, and in sufficient concentration, entirely reliable. It had most probably been administered in a drink. Time of death was estimated between 10:45 and midnight. The bar had closed at 10:30. The Pelch confirmed he had served Ashworth a final whisky at approximately 10:15. Ashworth had remained at the bar for perhaps 10 minutes after that, then said good night and gone toward the stairs. He had not, apparently, gone up them. Miss Marple set her knitting down for a moment and looked out toward the courtyard, where the ash tree stood in the afternoon light, its branches perfectly still. Digitalin was a compound that required knowledge to use correctly. Not specialist knowledge. A determined amateur with access to a library could manage it, but knowledge of dosage, of timing, of the body's particular susceptibility under certain conditions. It was not a weapon of impulse. Someone had planned this, had planned it before arriving in Dryford Halt, which meant the invitation had been the point, not the response to it. Miss Vane's letter had said, "Come alone." Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. The question was not whether Miss Vane had arranged the meeting. She plainly had. The question, the more interesting, more dangerous question, was who else had known about it. Chapter 5. The Thing Nobody Noticed. Miss Marple visited Dorothy Crayle that afternoon. Dorothy was exactly as she had always been, sharp-tongued, warm-hearted, and entirely unwilling to admit to either quality, and she received Miss Marple in her sitting room with a pot of strong tea, a plate of shortbread that she claimed to have made herself and had clearly purchased, and the focused attention of a woman who has been largely confined to her cottage since August and is consequently ravenous for information of any quality. "Well," said Dorothy, at the moment Miss Marple had settled and removed her gloves, "tell me everything. Mrs. Ogden rang twice this morning and was completely useless." Miss Marple told her a measured amount, the broad facts, the inspector's position, the general texture of the inn's atmosphere, and watched Dorothy's face with the quiet attention she brought to all faces in the first minutes of a conversation, before people remembered they were being observed. Dorothy listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough to be significant. "Gerald Ashworth," she said when Miss Marple had finished. She said it in the way one repeats a name one has heard before, and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. "You knew him," said Miss Marple. Not a question. Dorothy set her teacup down, with a precision that was in itself an answer. "He came to see me in July. He said he was interested in purchasing the back parcels. Raymond's land, the 11 acres behind the church wall that I've never done anything useful with and couldn't afford to manage properly, even if I wished to." She paused. "He was pleasant, well-dressed, offered a fair price, possibly more than fair, which naturally made me wonder why." "And did you sell?" "I told him I would consider it. Then I heard nothing more until—" She stopped. "Until," said Miss Marple gently, "until 3 weeks ago. I received a letter, not from Ashworth, from a solicitor in London, informing me that the 11 acres were being claimed against an outstanding debt from my late husband's estate, a debt I had no knowledge of whatsoever." Dorothy's voice remained level, but her hands had tightened slightly around her cup. "To a debt apparently purchased some years ago by a third party, whose name the solicitor was not at liberty to disclose." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you tell anyone about this letter?" "Only my own solicitor. And Howard Pelch, because the debt apparently involved a secondary claim on the inn's original lease, something from the old arrangement between Raymond and Pelch's father. Howard needed to know." She looked at Miss Marple directly. "I didn't kill him, Jane." "No," said Miss Marple. "I don't imagine you did. You are far too angry to have had time to plan it." Dorothy stared at her for a moment, and then laughed, abruptly, the way people laugh when a truth arrives without warning. That is either a compliment or an insult. "It is an observation," said Miss Marple, and reached for the shortbread. She returned to the inn at 4 o'clock and went directly to the bar, which was quiet at that hour. Pelch behind the counter, polishing glasses with the absorbed concentration of a man performing a task because standing still would require him to think. Miss Marple ordered a small sherry and sat at the bar itself, which she did not habitually do, because it placed her closer to Pelch and gave her a different view of the room. She sat for a while in companionable silence. Pelch polished. The fire worked quietly. Then she said, "Mr. Pelch, the bar mat, the one at the far end." He looked up. "Ma'am, it's been moved. It was at this end last evening. I noticed it particularly because Mr. Ashworth set his glass on it when he first came in, and then it was at the other end by the time I left." She smiled pleasantly. "I have a habit of noticing small things, a tiresome quality in a guest, I'm afraid." Pelch's hands slowed slightly on the glass. "I moved them about. No particular reason." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "I only mention it because I wondered whether anyone had sat at the far end of the bar last evening. After the main crowd left, I mean. One doesn't always notice these things at the time, but Mr. Ashworth was there, and if someone joined him at that end, it might have been someone you've already mentioned to the inspector." Pelch put the glass down. He looked at it rather than at her. "There was someone," he said finally. "After 10, when the others had gone up, a local came in through the side door, which regulars sometimes do." He paused. "He said he was just after a quick half. He and Ashworth spoke for perhaps 10 minutes. Did they know each other? They seemed to. Or they spoke as men speak when they have business, and wish to appear as though they have none." He picked up another glass. "I didn't think anything of it at the time." "Who was it?" said Miss Marple. Pelch hesitated. It was a long hesitation, the hesitation of a man weighing loyalty against something heavier than loyalty. "Martin Crayle," he said, "Dorothy Crayle's son." Miss Marple finished her sherry in a thoughtful silence. Martin Crayle, who stood to inherit the 11 acres, who would have known about the solicitor's letter, who had, as Miss Marple now recalled from Dorothy's sitting room, a detail so small she had almost discarded it, been visiting his mother the week before from London. From London, where Ashworth had arranged everything. She set her glass down and thanked Pelch quietly. The bar mat, she reflected, walking back to her chair. Nobody had mentioned the bar mat. Nobody had thought to look at which end of the bar held the fingerprints that mattered. Small things. It was always the small things. Chapter 6. What Sons Conceal. Martin Crayle arrived in Dryford Halt at 5:30 in a motor car that was slightly too expensive for a man of his stated profession, which was something in property investment that he described differently depending on who was asking. He was 34, lean and dark like his father had been, with his mother's eyes and none of her directness, a combination that produced, in Miss Marple's estimation, the particular type of man who is charming in precisely the way that charm is deployed as a substitute for honesty, as she observed his arrival from the window of the inn's first-floor landing, where she had gone to retrieve her spare wool, and had paused quite naturally to look out at the courtyard below. He parked beside the stone wall, sat in the car for a moment without moving, the stillness of a man composing himself rather than resting, and then got out and walked toward the inn, with the measured step of someone who has rehearsed the distance. He did not look at the ash tree. Miss Marple found that interesting. Every other person who had crossed that courtyard since morning had looked at the tree instinctively, drawn by the knowledge of what had been found beneath it. Martin Crayle kept his eyes on the inn door with the focused deliberateness of a man actively choosing not to look at something. That was a different thing entirely from not knowing. He went first to his mother's cottage. Miss Marple knew this because she had positioned herself 20 minutes later on the bench outside the lending library with her knitting and a clear sight line to Dorothy's front path, and she saw him come back out after 40 minutes with the expression of a man whose conversation had gone differently than anticipated. Dorothy, Miss Marple suspected, had not been gentle. He stood on the path for a moment, turned his collar up against the October cold, and then did something unexpected. Instead of returning to his car, he walked up the lane toward the church, pushed through the iron gate in the stone wall, and stood looking at the 11 acres of Crayle land that stretched behind it. Rough autumn grass, an old stone outhouse at the far edge, and the whole of it bounded by hedgerow on 3 sides and the church wall on the 4th. He stood there for 4 minutes. Miss Marple counted with the patience of long practice. Then he came back through the gate and walked directly toward the inn, and Miss Marple gathered her knitting with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who has been doing nothing at all and intends to continue doing it. At dinner, Martin Crayle took the table nearest the door. He ordered soup and a chop and a glass of red wine, and ate with the mechanical regularity of someone fueling rather than dining, his attention moving around the room in the quick cataloguing way that Miss Marple recognized from his mother, the habit of assessment, differently applied. Colonel Fenton, whose appetite for other people's business was inexhaustible, introduced himself within 4 minutes. Martin received him with practiced ease, the handshake, the direct gaze, the immediately deployed first name, and answered the Colonel's questions about who he was and what he did with sentences that were entirely grammatical and almost entirely uninformative. Miss Cecily Vane came down at 7. She had changed into a dark green dress and done her hair differently, softer, slightly less armoured, and she paused in the doorway of the dining room in a way that was perhaps unconscious and perhaps not. Martin Crayle looked up. The look lasted 1 second, less possibly. But Miss Marple, who had been watching both of them with the peripheral attention she had spent 80 years perfecting, saw it with complete clarity. They knew each other, not in the way he had known Ashworth, not that wary, circling familiarity of men with business between them. This was older than that, more complicated, the particular quality of people who share a history they have not finished deciding what to do with. Miss Vane took her table by the window. She did not look at Martin Crayle again during dinner. He looked at her twice when he thought no one was watching. Miss Marple retired early, or appeared to. She went upstairs at 8:30, changed into her dressing gown, sat in the chair by her window with her knitting and her thoughts. and at 9:15 heard voices in the courtyard below. She did not open the window. She did not need to. The courtyard's stone walls had the acoustic quality of old buildings. They carried sound upward with surprising fidelity. Martin Crayle's voice first. Low, controlled, but with the tightness of someone holding a larger emotion carefully in check. "You should have told me he was coming here." Miss Vane's voice, quieter still. "I didn't know you were connected to him. Not until it was too late to—" "Connected?" A short, humourless sound. "Is that what we're calling it?" "What would you call it?" Silence. The ash tree shifted in a faint wind. "He had the documents," Martin said. "All of them. The original loan agreement, the transfer of debt, everything. If that valise— The valise is gone," she said. "Gone where?" "I don't know." A pause. "Martin, I did not kill him." Another silence, longer than the first. "No," he said at last, with a heaviness that was not quite relief. "I don't think you did either." "Then we need to agree on what we tell the inspector." "We tell him the truth," said Martin. "As much of it as we can afford to." Their footsteps moved back toward the inn door. The courtyard fell quiet. Miss Marple sat without moving for a full minute, her needles still. "As much of it as we can afford to." She had heard many versions of that sentence over the years, in many different mouths. It never meant what it sounded like it meant. It meant, "We will choose the truth that costs us least," which was not truth at all, but a careful arrangement of facts wearing truth's clothing. And somewhere, in a missing valise, apparently, was the arrangement that mattered. Chapter 7. The Second Disturbance. The incident occurred at 7:20 the following morning, before most of the inn had properly woken. And it was Miss Marple who heard it first. A sharp crack from somewhere below, followed by the specific quality of silence that follows a sound people are hoping no one noticed. She was already dressed. She had slept poorly, not from distress but from the particular alertness that came upon her when a problem was nearing its resolution, and her mind refused the courtesy of pausing for the night. She had been sitting with her tea and her thoughts since 6, watching the ash tree in the early grey light, and she was at her door and on the landing within 30 seconds of the sound. Howard Pelch was below, at the entrance to the small private dining room. The door was ajar. His face, visible from the landing, held the expression of a man confronting something he did not entirely know how to classify. Miss Marple came downstairs without hurrying. Of the private dining room, the same room where Dace had conducted his interviews, had been entered during the night. The table had been moved slightly. The chair behind it was overturned, not violently, but with the casual displacement of something disturbed in haste. The jug of water, still untouched since the inspector's sessions, had been knocked to the floor, which explained the crack. It had not shattered, heavy ceramic, but it lay on its side with water spreading slowly across the floorboards. On the table itself, a leather satchel. Not the missing valise, smaller, darker, the kind used for documents. It was open. Whatever it had contained was gone. Inspector Dace arrived at 8:30, this time without the slope-shouldered authority of his first appearance, but he moved through the room with the slightly deflated efficiency of a man whose case has quietly rearranged itself overnight without consulting him. Constable Reeve made many more notes than usual, which Miss Marple interpreted as compensation. The satchel, Pelch confirmed, was not his, not the inn's, and had not been present in the room when he'd cleared it the previous evening at 7. Someone had brought it in during the night, which meant either entry through the side door, which Pelch confirmed he habitually left unlocked until midnight, or from within the inn itself. Dace requested, with somewhat more urgency than his previous manner had suggested he possessed, that all guests remain in the building for the morning. Miss Vane received this instruction with unchanged composure. Colonel Fentham received it with enormous enthusiasm. Martin Crayle received it standing in the doorway of the dining room fully dressed and apparently unsurprised, which told Miss Marple, who was watching from the hall, something she had already begun to suspect, but was glad to have confirmed. Mrs. Trask arrived at 9, ostensibly with a jar of her own-made bramble jelly for Pelch, which he accepted with the mechanical gratitude of a man who has received a great deal of unsolicited bramble jelly during periods of difficulty. She installed herself in the bar and had the morning's revised situation assembled within 20 minutes, which Miss Marple considered practically professional. "Someone broke in for papers," she announced to the bar at large, which contained herself, Miss Marple, Fentham, and Pip Rudder, who had been told to sweep the floor and was doing so with the speed of someone unwilling to leave. "Which means there were papers worth breaking in for. Which means someone knew they were here." "Or put them here," said Miss Marple pleasantly. Mrs. Trask looked at her. "Planted them, you mean? It is one possibility. If one wished Inspector Dace to search a particular room for a particular reason, the simplest method would be to ensure there was something in it worth searching for." She smoothed her knitting, and then to remove it before he arrived. "But then what was the point?" said Fentham. "The point," said Miss Marple, "would be the search itself. What the inspector found, or didn't find, or thought he was meant to find." There was a silence while this arranged itself in the room. "That's a great deal of bother," said Mrs. Trask finally. "For a very indirect result." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "It is, which suggests the person doing the arranging is in considerable difficulty and has run out of more straightforward options." Dace interviewed Martin Crayle at 10 o'clock. The interview lasted 35 minutes, which was 20 minutes longer than his interview with Miss Vane, and 28 minutes longer than his interview with Fentham. Miss Marple, knitting in the corner of the bar with the steady invisibility she had spent a lifetime cultivating, could hear the rise and fall of voices, but not the words, which was sufficient. The rhythm of an interview, the long pauses, the sudden quickening, the flat plateau of confirmed information communicated its own meaning. When Martin emerged, he looked older by a degree that had nothing to do with time past. He went directly to the bar, accepted a whisky from Pelch without speaking, and stood with it for a moment before apparently deciding it would not help and setting it back down. Miss Vane came into the bar from the passage. They looked at each other. "He knows," said Martin. "How much?" she said. "Enough. Someone talked." He turned the glass slowly on the bar. "The document transfer. The original loan. He had dates, amounts, things that weren't in any letter I wrote." Miss Vane was quiet for a moment. Then carefully. "Pelch?" The name landed in the room with the particular weight of a conclusion rather than a question. Martin looked at the bar, at the glass, at the distance between them. "Pelch," he said. "Yes." They had not noticed Miss Marple. People rarely did at moments of this nature. She occupied so little space, and made so little demand on the atmosphere, that she became simply part of the room's furniture. It was, she had long considered, one of the most useful qualities she possessed. She turned her knitting and continued. "Pelch, who had the side door key, who had 15 years of inherited debt and a grudge of specific, provable proportions." who had stood at the far end of the bar and watched Gerald Ashworth drink his final whisky. The case was not what Dace thought it was. It was considerably simpler, which was often the way. Chapter 8. The Gentlest Trap. Miss Marple spent the morning in apparent idleness. She finished 2 rows of knitting. She asked Pip Rudder to bring her a fresh pot of tea. She read 3 pages of the novel she had brought from St. Mary Mead, and found she retained none of them, and which was unusual. She had a good memory for fiction, having long observed that it was frequently more reliable than fact. She looked out at the ash tree. She thought carefully about the order in which she intended to do what she had decided to do, and having thought it through twice and found the logic sound, she set her knitting in her bag, smoothed her skirt, and went to find Howard Pelch. She located him in the cellar, checking inventory with the absorbed efficiency of a man who finds comfort in countable things. "Mr. Pelch," she said from the cellar steps, "I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment. I have been thinking about something rather puzzling, and I suspect you may be able to help." Pelch looked up. In the cellar light, his face was difficult to read, which suited him. "Of course, Miss Marple. It is about the foxglove," she said pleasantly. "In the window box outside the saloon bar. I noticed it yesterday. A rather fine specimen, actually. Quite late in the season. My niece keeps a kitchen garden, and I know how difficult they can be at this time of year." She paused. "I only mention it because I understand the police have been asking about digitalin and foxgloves being the obvious source. I wondered whether they had noticed it too." She said this in the vague, mildly inquiring tone of a woman making conversation about horticulture, maintaining her expression of gentle puzzlement throughout. Pelch was very still. Not the stillness of a man thinking. The stillness of a man who has ceased to think and begun instead to calculate. "I hadn't considered it," he said. His voice was level, almost perfectly level. "No, I expect not," said Miss Marple. "These things are so easy to overlook. I mentioned it to that nice constable this morning. Reeve, is it? Just in passing. I'm sure he'll pass it along to the inspector." She smiled warmly. "I do hope it isn't inconvenient." She went back up the cellar steps at the same unhurried pace she had descended them. She returned to her chair and picked up her knitting and waited. It did not take long. Within 12 minutes, Pelch appeared from the kitchen passage, crossed the bar without looking at her, went out through the side door, and could be heard, briefly at the edge of hearing, moving quickly across the courtyard cobbles. Miss Marple counted to 60. Then she set her knitting down, went to the window, and observed. Pelch was at the far end of the courtyard, out beside the old stone outhouse that abutted the inn's eastern wall. He was not going in. He was standing beside it, looking at the ground near its base with the focused intensity of a man confirming something. His hands were in his pockets, and he was very still, not calculating now, but verifying. He had hidden it there, or removed it from there, or both, at different moments, the valise almost certainly, possibly the documents from the satchel. Miss Marple had not told Constable Reeve anything about any foxglove. She had told him, very briefly, that she thought it might be worth someone looking at the ground beside the old stone outhouse in the eastern courtyard, and had done so 40 minutes before descending to the cellar, while Pelch was occupied with a delivery at the front of the inn. She returned to her chair, as Reeve and a second constable arrived in the courtyard at 11:15. Pelch saw them from 20 feet away and stopped moving, which is the moment at which a man's body acknowledges what his mind has not quite finished refusing. Miss Marple watched from the window. The valise was in the outhouse, not beside it, pushed beneath a low shelf under a loose board that the constables found within 4 minutes of looking. Inside it, as Miss Marple had anticipated, were documents, a considerable quantity. The original loan agreement from 15 years prior, by which Raymond Pelch had borrowed against the inn's lease from a company that turned out, on examination of its registration, to be controlled by a private trust. The trust, on further examination, led to the name of a single beneficiary. Gerald Ashworth was also in the valise, a separate folder, newer, concerning the Crayle land. The debt transfer, the secondary claim, the legal mechanism by which Ashworth had intended to absorb 11 acres of Dryford Halt into a development scheme that required, as its central parcel, both the land behind the church and the inn itself. Pelch had known about it, had known for 15 years that his inn was being slowly consumed by a patient financial arrangement, and had spent those 15 years building a presentable surface over a foundations-level dread. When Ashworth had arrived in Dryford Halt on the 14th, it was not to collect. It was to conclude. To present terms that amounted, in their final form, to an offer, generous in numerical terms and absolute in practical ones. Sell the inn, vacate. The debt is cleared, the claim is settled, and the development proceeds. Howard Pelch had served him a whiskey. Then, while the bar was quiet and the other guests had gone, he had served him another at the far end of the bar, beside the moved bar mat, away from the light, and into that one he had measured, with the careful precision of a man who had thought about this for considerably longer than one evening. A compound derived from the foxglove plants he cultivated in the window box outside, because it produced no wound, left no mark, and took its time. He had then sent Ashworth outside to wait for Martin Crayle, who had arranged to meet him later, independently, for reasons of his own, and he had gone upstairs and waited for morning with the methodical patience of a man who has always been good at waiting. Miss Marple was still at her window when Dace led Pelch across the courtyard. At 11:45. She watched without satisfaction. She rarely felt satisfaction at these moments, which people sometimes found puzzling. What she felt was the particular quiet of a thing correctly concluded, the same quality as the last stitch of a finished row, no more and no less. The ash tree stood over the empty courtyard in the pale autumn light, its branches trailing, witnessing nothing further. Chapter 9. How it fitted. Inspector Dace, to his credit, asked. He came to find Miss Marple at 2 o'clock, after Pelch had been taken to the county station, and the courtyard had been photographed, and the valise catalogued with the thorough, slightly belated efficiency of official process catching up to conclusions it had not itself reached. He sat down across from her in the bar quiet now. Fenton and Mrs. Trask having retired to the dining room with the slightly deflated air of people whose entertainment has concluded before they were quite ready. And he looked at her with the expression of a man revising a category. "You knew," he said, "not an accusation, almost a question." "I suspected," said Miss Marple, which was more precise. "Suspicion and knowledge are quite different things, Inspector. Acting on the first before establishing the second is how innocent people suffer." She folded her knitting into her lap. "Would it be useful if I explained how it appeared to me?" "It would," said Dace, with a directness she respected. "Then I will begin with the bar mat," said Miss Marple, "because that is where it actually begins." "The bar mat was moved," she said, "from one end of the bar to the other between the time I sat down for the evening and the time I went up to my room. In itself, this means nothing. Bar mats are moved constantly. But I had noticed that Mr. Ashworth took his position at that specific end of the bar when he arrived, and that he remained there throughout the evening. When someone stands at one position for several hours, and a proprietary object moves to accommodate them, it generally stays where they are, unless someone else chose that position deliberately after the crowd had thinned. She paused. Pelch moved it. He moved it to draw Ashworth to the far end, the end away from the window, away from the remaining guests where the light was poorest, and the landlord's movements behind the bar were least observed. He knew Ashworth would follow the glass, but people always follow where their drink is placed. Dace nodded slowly. The second thing was the foxglove, she continued, or rather, the knowledge required to use it correctly. Digitalin is not a compound one arrives at by accident. It requires an understanding of concentration, of the body's absorption rate, of the delay between ingestion and effect, which in this case was long enough to allow Ashworth to leave the bar, cross the courtyard, and reach the ash tree before his heart failed. That delay was intentional. It placed the death outside the inn, away from the bar, away from any drink. It was a planned delay by someone who understood the timing precisely. Pelch had that knowledge? Pelch had 15 years of motive, Inspector, which concentrates the mind considerably. But yes, I found, when I looked, that Raymond Pelch, a Howard's father, had been treated for a heart condition in his final years. Howard would have had occasion during that period to learn a great deal about cardiac medication, dosage, and the plants from which such compounds derive. The foxgloves in the window box were not decorative. They were very old plants, well established, not recently purchased. Dace made a note. Miss Marple continued. The valise was the third thing. The moment you confirmed it was missing, I understood the shape of it. A man who books 3 nights and pays in advance does not pack unless he has arranged to leave before morning, or unless he has been told to bring something specific. The valise was not luggage. It was a document case disguised as luggage. Ashworth brought the papers to Dryford Halt, because he intended the meeting with Pelch to be the final one. The development required both the inn and the Crayle land, and he had come to present the terms that made resistance legally impossible. And Pelch knew this. Pelch had known it was coming for some time. Martin Crayle's visit to his mother 3 weeks prior, and the letter Dorothy received from the London solicitor, these were not coincidental. Ashworth was consolidating, calling in every element simultaneously so that no single party could resist independently. She settled her hands on her knitting. Pelch understood that the evening of the 14th was his last opportunity. Once those papers were formally presented and witnessed, if the legal machinery would proceed regardless of whether Ashworth was present to observe it. So he killed him and took the papers. He killed him, took the papers, and placed the satchel in the private dining room as a misdirection, something for you to find that pointed toward document theft while the actual documents remained hidden. He correctly anticipated that you would focus on Miss Vane, whose letter was conveniently in Ashworth's pocket. He may even have anticipated that the letter would be found. It is possible he knew of its existence, had overheard something, and considered it a useful circumstance. Dace looked at her steadily. And Miss Vane? Miss Vane is precisely what she appeared to be, a creditor who wanted her money returned, and had traced Ashworth to Dryford Halt. Her letter arranged the meeting. She knew nothing of Pelch's arrangement. and has no part in the crime beyond the accidental provision of a suspect." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but unambiguous. She and Martin Crayle had met previously in London through their mutual connection to Ashworth's financial dealings. Their concealment of that relationship was protective, of each other and of information they feared would implicate them, but it was not guilt. Frightened people frequently behave as though they are guilty of things they have not done. It is one of the more persistent inconveniences of human nature. "There is one final thing," said Miss Marple, after a short pause. "The tree." Dace looked up. Every person who crossed that courtyard after the body was removed looked at the ash tree, instinctively. People always look at the place where something dreadful has happened. There is a pull to it that is almost involuntary. She was quiet for a moment. Martin Crayle did not look. When he arrived yesterday evening and crossed the courtyard, he kept his eyes on the inn door with great deliberateness. That is not the behaviour of a man who doesn't know. It is the behaviour of a man who knows too well and is frightened of what his face might do. He knew Pelch had done it. He suspected by then. He had been at the inn the night before the body was found, not inside but nearby. He had seen Pelch in the courtyard late. He had not said so because he could not say so without explaining what he himself had been doing there, which was meeting Ashworth privately to attempt negotiation. She smoothed a length of wool absently. He is not an admirable man, Inspector, but he is not a murderer. There is a meaningful distinction, though the law does not always find it convenient. Dace closed his notebook. He sat for a moment in the particular silence of a man reassembling a picture that has been reorganized around him. "How did you know to look at the outhouse?" he said at last. "I did not know," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I considered where I would put something if I had taken it from an inn in the dark, and needed it close enough to retrieve, but not inside the building. The outhouse shared a wall. It was old enough to have loose boards, and it was the one structure in the courtyard that no one had thought to look at, because it was too obvious to seem significant." She picked up her knitting again. "Obvious things are so frequently overlooked. I have never understood why." Chapter 10. The Ordinary Weight of Things. Dryford Halt took 2 days to return to itself, which was faster than Miss Marple had expected, and slower than the village believed. By Thursday morning, Inspector Dace had returned to the county station with his notes, his revised conclusions, and the valise and its contents bagged and catalogued as evidence. Constable Reeve remained another day, conducting the final formalities with the conscientious thoroughness of a young man, aware that he had not distinguished himself, and determined to compensate in paperwork. The twine came down from the courtyard. Pip Rudder swept the cobbles with the focused energy of someone reclaiming a space from its recent history. And by midday, the Weeping Ash Inn looked, from the outside, very much as it had on the evening Miss Marple arrived. The ash tree stood as it always had, patient, trailing, indifferent to human conclusions. Miss Cecily Vane departed on Thursday afternoon. She settled her bill with Howard Pelch's replacement, a cousin summoned from Guildford, who had the family's watchful quality without yet having acquired the reason for it, and carried her own bag to her car, declining the offered assistance with a brief, genuine smile that was the first Miss Marple had seen from her without the architecture of composure behind it. She paused on the path outside the inn's low door, and Miss Marple, who happened to be sitting on the bench beside it in the October sun with her knitting, said pleasantly, "Safe journey, my dear." Miss Vane looked at her, really looked, and in the direct way that people rarely do with elderly women, they have not taken seriously, and said, "You knew from the beginning, didn't you, that it wasn't me?" "I thought it very unlikely," said Miss Marple, "from the moment I saw how steady your hands were at breakfast." She smoothed her wool. "Guilty people tremble, as a rule. It is the frightened innocent who achieve perfect stillness. They are holding themselves together by an effort of will that leaves no room for trembling." Miss Vane was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't know whether that's comforting." "It isn't meant to be," said Miss Marple kindly. "It is simply true." Miss Vane nodded once, with the particular quality of someone accepting a truth they will think about for some time, and walked to her car. Colonel Fenton left on Friday morning with enormous handshakes. A parting remark to the Guildford cousin about the importance of decent locks on side doors. And the satisfied expression of a man who has witnessed something worth witnessing. He had revised his theory 3 times since Monday, and retained no embarrassment about this, which Miss Marple considered a respectable quality in a person of any age. He shook Miss Marple's hand at the door with surprising gentleness. "You're a remarkable woman," he said, with the directness of a man who does not pay compliments unless he means them precisely. "I am an observant one," said Miss Marple, "which is not the same thing, though people are forever treating it as such." Fenton laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh, and went to his car. Martin Crayle had gone Wednesday evening, quietly and without farewells, which was appropriate, and he had given Dace a full account of his meetings with Ashworth, the London negotiations, the private meeting arranged for the evening of the 14th that Ashworth had never kept, because he was dead before Martin arrived at the agreed hour. He had cooperated completely once the alternative became clear, which Miss Marple considered the lowest acceptable standard of behaviour, but acknowledged was at least met. Whether he and his mother would mend things between them was not a matter Miss Marple could determine, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she was not entirely certain what she hoped. Dorothy was not a simple woman, and simple resolutions rarely satisfied complex people. She walked to Dorothy's cottage on Friday afternoon. The lane behind the church was quiet in the October light, leaves down, with the air carrying that particular quality of things concluding without drama, which Miss Marple had always found more honest than autumn's reputation for spectacle. She walked at her own pace, her knitting bag over one arm, and she did not think about Howard Pelch, because she had thought about him sufficiently, and arrived at the same place she always arrived, which was not comfort and not judgment, but a kind of sorrowful clarity. He had built a life on land that was being quietly consumed beneath it. He had watched it for 15 years and done nothing, and then done the one irrevocable thing, which is so often the pattern. People endure the long pressure patiently, and then shatter suddenly at the one moment when patience might actually have served them. The development without Ashworth would stall, or the legal claim would take years to resolve. He might, had he waited one more season, have found a way through. But people, in Miss Marple's long experience, rarely waited the necessary extra season. That was the persistent tragedy of human nature, not wickedness, which was straightforward enough, but timing. The failure to hold on for precisely long enough. She did not share this reflection with Dorothy. Dorothy had tea ready, and a plate of shop-bought shortbread, and the focused, forward-looking expression of a woman who has received difficult news and processed it and moved on, which was Dorothy's particular form of resilience, and always had been. they talked about the garden, about Dorothy's nerves, which were improving now that she had something to be angry about rather than something to be vague about, about the lending library and Mrs. Ogden, and whether the butcher had improved since the summer. After an hour, Dorothy said, without preamble, he was going to take the land. Yes, said Miss Marple, the 11 acres. Yes. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Martin didn't handle it well. No, said Miss Marple, he didn't. Another silence, comfortable in the way of old friendship, which can hold more truth in its quiet than conversation usually manages. Will you stay the fortnight? Said Dorothy. Yes, said Miss Marple. I think I will. She picked up her knitting. Outside the cottage window, the October afternoon settled into its early dusk, slow and grey and unconcerned, and Dryford Halt went about its business with the practised composure of a place that had decided once again that nothing interesting would happen to it. It had been wrong before. It would, in all likelihood, be wrong again.